Hello, I'm Jonathan Downey, and this is my response video to John Swales' video on Interpreter Neutrality, which featured on the excellent A Word in Your Ear YouTube channel, a channel that I highly recommend. Those of you who know me in any way will realise that this is a subject which is very close to my heart. I've written about neutrality extensively. I've done research looking at neutrality. I read about neutrality all the time, and of course there's at least one chapter in my first book, Being a Successful Interpreter, Adding Value and Delivering Excellence, which is dedicated to neutrality. And I want to take on the position here not just as Dr. Jonathan Downey, interpreting researcher, but Dr. Jonathan Downey, consultant interpreter, and someone who's passionate about the future of the profession. But let's first begin at the points where Mr. Swales and I are in complete agreement. Firstly, I agree with him totally that neutrality goes to the heart of professional ethics. In fact, there's a good argument that neutrality goes to the heart of any definition of what it means to be an interpreter. Only when we understand the scope and the importance of the neutrality principle can we understand what interpreting is all about. I am entirely in agreement there. I also agree with him fully that interpreters need to be trusted by their clients. If they don't trust us, they don't get us back. Fair enough. What they should trust us to do is something I'll be looking at very soon in this video. I also mostly agree with him that interpreters should not go around wearing their political affiliations on their sleeve. I would agree that if one is interpreting for the Spanish government, it may not be politic or sensible to wear an emblem of the Catalonian independence campaign on your sleeve or in your shirt pocket. Fair enough. Yeah, even here we partially disagree in that I've come across clients on the private market for whom the affiliation of the interpreter with their cause is taken as read. Whether one agrees with that assumption or not, it's true to say that for some clients, for some interpreting buyers, there's this view that you wouldn't be there interpreting unless you agreed with them, or that you have to agree with them to be able to interpret them adequately. I know this probably doesn't ever come up in the European Parliament or the European Union, but certainly on the private market, it's not unknown. So we mostly agree there. But there are problems in the neutrality garden. The first and greatest problem with neutrality is that we actually don't know what neutrality is. This might sound silly, but it's true. If you ask most interpreters what does neutrality mean, you'll get a range of definitions from I've never heard the term to it's something to do with impartiality. Well, if you fancy a fun trip, let's go further down that rabbit hole and ask what impartiality means. Someone else might say it's about not adding or omitting anything from what the speaker said and perhaps being a neutral conduit. Well, fair enough. That seems to be largely Mr. Swales' definition. Is it about fairness or transparency? Some people might come up with this grandiose view that neutrality in interpreting is about generally being fair and transparent and open and so on. And again, you could go down that rabbit hole and ask, well, what does that mean? So the biggest problem with neutrality is that until we agree on what neutrality is, we can't actually decide on whether it's useful. It sounds like a very silly argument to make, but it's an important one. Let's not defend something until we know what it is that we're actually defending. Now, let's take what I believe to be Mr. Swales' view and see neutrality as being a conduit, a faithful representation, and not adding or omitting anything from what the speaker said. This has the very convenient advantage that if you ask most clients what their expectations of interpreters are in general, this is largely what many, not all, but what many clients will tell you. Fair enough. But there's a problem. Since at least the mid-1990s, research has shown us that no interpreter is neutral by this definition. In court interpreting, the traditional home of neutrality and just saying what the speaker said, Philip Angermeyer, amongst others, has found interpreters taking small decisions such as changing the pronouns. So instead of the speaker say, when the speaker says I, the interpreter might say she, At some points, doing that so that it's more intelligible if they're interpreting simultaneously into someone's ear who doesn't understand the language of the court. In conference interpreting, researchers such as Sheda Raslan and Ebru Deriker have found interpreters doing things like softening the impact of things, or speaking to speakers to help them speak more effectively to the audience, changing jokes to make them less offensive, putting in strategic omissions, adding explanations, and so on and so forth, all very unneutral behaviour. In business negotiation interpreting, fellow Heriot Watt PhD student Penny Carinaccio has found that many business negotiation clients actually expect the interpreters to work as partners rather than just as this neutral go-between that has nothing to do with the outcome of the event. In medical interpreting, Claudia Angelelli, amongst many others, has found interpreters inserting cultural explanations. The most famous and most well-known of these is that, some family doctors may use pain scales. So they may say on a scale of 1 to 10, how sore is it? Well, if you have a patient who comes from a culture where those aren't used, it helps to have an interpreter say to the patient, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not sore at all, and 10 is the worst pain you can imagine, how sore is it? Now that's in some ways a minor addition. Some people would say it's a major addition, but it's the kind of addition that we are seeing medical interpreters consistently do. And in the echelons and another home of neutrality in the European Parliament itself, Morven Beaton did research where she found that interpreters were making subtle changes to the words and the speeches of those whose ideology was not coherent with that of the European Union to make them slightly more palatable. Whether this is deliberate or whether this is accidental remains to be seen, but the effect is there. The interesting thing is that in all of these, it seems that mostly the interpreter intervention is actually helpful. In Philip Angermeyer's work, he found that interpreters who didn't change pronouns when using whispered interpreting ended up with the people using the interpreter not understanding what was going on. We're now on the point, as researchers are saying, that it's not whether we should intervene or not as interpreters, it's simply that intervention of some form seems to be a necessary part of fostering cross-cultural communication. As my translation and interpreting theory teacher Ian Mason used to say, languages are not isomorphic. That's the academic way of saying that, knowing the German word for dog is not always sufficient to be able to interpret. Sometimes there needs to be a cultural explanation, sometimes there needs to be a cultural substitution, something that translators know all about, in order for the event to actually work. Robin Dean from Sign Language Interpreting is someone who I'll mention later. Her work is very good at talking about this. She talks about interpreters working towards the goal of the situation, not necessarily favouring one client or the other, heaven forbid, but interpreting in such a way that the situation itself reaches its goal. So the third problem with neutrality is that, at least in research terms, and at least in terms of those who have taken the trouble to do field research on interpreting, the conduit model and our traditional views of neutrality are dead. This is despite the attempt by some researchers to say that they're merely pining for the fjords. The parrot is dead. It's dead because there's no evidence of its usefulness, it's difficult to define, and when we look at interpreters' work, we don't see neutrality. If we look in the mirror, we're not looking at neutral interpreters. The fourth problem that I have with neutrality is one which may be specific to commercial interpreting, private market interpreting, but seems to start having more and more resonance even in the policies of interpreting in international organizations. Neutrality is incredibly bad public relations. Let's imagine for a moment that you are the perfect neutral interpreter. For many interpreters, the ideal interpreter is neutral and invisible. It's the interpreter who makes as few changes as possible. It's the interpreter who acts as if the speaker suddenly of their own free will with no training had learned to speak Dutch or Swedish or whatever. The problem with an invisible service is that people tend not to value it. If our main foundation of the profession is that we're invisible and we don't make a difference, then we're inviting people to reduce our conditions and try to replace us with machines. And it will be our own fault. I understand it is politically expedient in international organisations and legally expedient in court. But as well as being not accurate, it's probably not good for us. The more we play the neutrality card and the invisibility card, the less respect we get. The less respect we get, the worse conditions we get. Have a look at the current debates around interpreting in the European Parliament. I may be overplaying my hand here, but there seems to be a correlation between the places where neutrality is held most dear and where interpreting conditions and pay are most under threat. The European Parliament, interpreting in court settings in many countries in the world. So what else should we replace neutrality with? It sounds like a dangerous game to use anything but neutrality, and indeed it is if we're not very, very smart. I believe that we have to start from the point that we should stop asking clients to trust us to be neutral, unfeeling conduits who never intervene, because that is deceptive. Instead, we should help our clients see us as their communication partners, without whom their message cannot get out into other languages, without whom their self-expression is locked in a single language community. It's not that we work for those whom we interpret, it's that we work with them. They should understand, as some of the respondents to my PhD interviews, that without interpreters, they cannot achieve what they want to achieve. And so the way to achieve what they want to achieve is to work with us. I owe a lot of my views on this to my senior PhD supervisor, Professor Graham Turner, and his work on what he calls real interpreting or quantum interpreting. I highly suggest that you look up those two terms and try to find his papers. And his idea being that real interpreting is what happens when everyone in the room is aware that the situation cannot proceed and cannot be successful unless everyone works together in a team. That meaning is not something that is objectively located outside of the situation, but something which is being actively negotiated together within the situation. It sounds highly technical, but it basically boils down to this. Great interpreting happens when our clients realize that we're both necessary and valuable, and they want to work with us. As one of the conclusions of my PhD is that those who see interpreting as necessary but not necessarily valuable tend to see us precisely in neutral conduit model terms. Those who see us as valuable and necessary tend to see us as partners. And it would be a tragedy if our clients are beginning to see us as partners and we stand back and hide behind neutrality. I absolutely and completely agree with Mr. Swales that neutrality goes to the heart of what it means to be an interpreter and to professional ethics. And that's precisely my issue with it. Rather than seeing neutrality and using neutrality as a hiding place, I'd like to see us use intelligent decision-making to push towards interpreting being what Robin Dean calls a practice profession. She points out that doctors don't hide behind the same views of confidentiality and neutrality as we do, but instead practice making smart decisions and thinking about the outcomes that are likely to come from those decisions. If I take this decision, what will the result be? If I use exactly the same pronouns as the speaker, how intelligible will the output be? If I tag the person speaking when you have multiple people having a discussion, what will that do to my output? What will that do to the meeting? Rather than saying we don't do anything, we don't ever intervene, I would like interpreters instead to think about the ways that we can be intelligent precisely in our interventions. It's very different to the way that we've been trained to be. It's a very different approach to interpreting. It's one that makes many interpreters uncomfortable. I'm aware of that discomfort, but growing is inherently uncomfortable. And it's also uncomfortable to see my colleagues in court interpreting in the European Parliament and in other places where neutrality has held sway see their conditions and their hard-fought wins stripped away from them piece by piece. It was incredibly uncomfortable to see the mistreatment of court interpreters in the United Kingdom, especially in England and Wales. It's only when the public and interpreters alike see the value in interpreting and see interpreters as active partners that we can secure the future of our profession. This is Dr. Jonathan Downey with a heartfelt plea for us to go beyond neutrality in our discussions of what it means to be an interpreter. Thank you very much.